She didn't flinch. The overhead paging system crackled at 2,100 hours and called for Dr. Caldwell in trauma, and Brooke Sullivan kept her hand steady on the supply cart, kept her eyes on the inventory sheet, kept breathing the way she had learned to breathe, slow, measured, nothing registering on her face. 3 years. That's how long she had been invisible at Sacred Heart in Jacksonville, moving through the night shift like a ghost, suturing lacerations with precision that made attending physicians pause and then dismiss her as competent but quiet, a woman who spoke only when necessary and whose eyes never lingered too long on anyone's face. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song overhead, flickering in that rhythm that drove most people to distraction. Not her. Brooke had learned to filter the hum, the same way she had learned to filter 1,000 other things that wanted to pull her attention, her focus, her voice out into spaces where they didn't belong anymore. The ER at Sacred Heart was a particular kind of chaos at night, controlled, professional, the kind of organized emergency that only happened when everyone understood the stakes and played their position. Brooke understood her position. She was the night shift supply nurse, the one who restocked trauma bays and kept the sterile trays arranged with mathematical precision, the one whose hands moved without thought through the rituals of preparation. Antiseptic sharp in her nostrils. Cold steel beneath her palms. The texture of sterile gloves snapping against her wrists like small percussion instruments marking time. She had arranged these supplies 10,000 times, maybe more, and each time she did it the same way, methodical, exact, the muscle memory of someone who had once arranged far more complicated equipment under far worse conditions. Other nurses at Sacred Heart knew her name was Brooke, knew she was reliable, knew she showed up and did the work without complaint. What they didn't know was that the scars tracking up her forearms like combat maps disappeared under long sleeves when the day shift arrived, that her movements had a precision built from 17 years of something very different than hospital work, that she touched the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining every single shift change, a ritual so small and private that no one had ever noticed it. The patch was from Sangin, from the 3rd Battalion 5th Marines, from a life that the Pentagon had decided should stop existing in any official capacity. That life had stopped. Mostly. The woman who had lived it now worked nights and kept her voice low and her eyes lower and filled out supply requisition forms in handwriting that was almost unrecognizable compared to the combat reports she used to file. At 2,247 hours, Sergeant Major Calderon came through the ER doors on a stretcher, and everything changed with the sound of the ambulance bay alert, a sharp electronic chirp that cut through the fluorescent hum. His chest was crushed. The trauma was immediate and absolute, the kind of thing that made even experienced ER staff unconsciously step back, the car accident that had wrapped him around the steering column having done what blunt force trauma does when it has gravity and velocity and metal on its side. Brooke looked up from the supply cart she was restocking near Bay 4 and saw him arrive, and for the first time in 3 years her hands stopped trembling. They stopped because something deeper than her body's trained responses recognized him. Sergeant Major Calderon. Her son Danny's commanding officer. The Marine who had pinned Lance Corporal Danny Sullivan's promotion to his collar 6 months ago at Camp Lezon, who had looked Danny in the eye and said Semper Fi, who had shaken his hand with the grip of a man who still believed in ceremony and honor even in a world that had mostly stopped caring about either. The ER physicians moved toward the trauma bay with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this 1,000 times, and Brooke found herself moving with them, her body recognizing the choreography without her mind having to authorize it. Trauma attended by Dr. Caldwell, the chief attending, a man whose institutional authority at Sacred Heart operated like gravity, everything bent toward him whether it wanted to or not. He had been chief for 6 years, had connections that ran up through administration and lateral into the board of directors, had the kind of presence that made younger doctors uncomfortable in a way they couldn't quite articulate. There was something beneath the professional demeanor, something that moved in the space behind his eyes when he thought no one was watching. Brooke had seen it before, in places where men held power without adequate supervision. She knew the look. She had seen it pointed at her twice in 3 years, and both times she had simply looked away. Dr. Caldwell emerged from the trauma bay 13 minutes later, and Brooke was standing nearby arranging a suture kit in Bay 3 when she heard him speak. His voice had that particular quality of finality that suggested the conversation was already over, that he was simply announcing a decision he had already made. Spinal involvement. Catastrophic bleeding. DNRH bracket. The words moved through the ER like something cold, and Brooke's hands went still on the surgical tray she was preparing. DNR. Do not resuscitate. A medical designation that was sometimes appropriate, sometimes necessary, and sometimes, in her experience, deployed as an instrument of control by men who preferred certain outcomes to others. She had seen Calderon's chart 2 weeks earlier. She had glimpsed it on Dr. Caldwell's desk when she was restocking his office supplies, the way a person glimpses a sign they aren't supposed to read, and what she had seen was the name Calderon, Sergeant Major, and underneath it, underlined in red, a single word, whistleblower. She had not touched the chart. She had not read beyond that one line. But that one line had been enough to lodge itself into her memory the way certain details do, the way certain truths announce themselves whether you ask for them or not. Caldwell was allowing this man to die. Not because the medicine demanded it, but because Calderon had seen something at Sacred Heart that wasn't supposed to be seen, had reported something that wasn't supposed to be reported, and was now inconvenient to a man whose position depended on inconvenient people remaining silent. Brooke placed the suture kit on the tray with a soft click of metal on metal and looked toward the trauma bay where they were still working on Calderon's chest, where the monitors were still beeping their urgent rhythm, where a man who had pinned her son's promotion was being allowed to die by someone whose power was so absolute that he could make a death look like medicine. She did not move immediately. She did not make a sound. She simply stood there in the ER of Sacred Heart, Jacksonville at 2,247 hours and 42 seconds, and she felt something shift inside her chest, something that had been dormant for 3 years, something that remembered what it was to refuse. Brooke took one measured breath. Just one. The kind of breath that contained decision, that contained commitment, that contained the terrible clarity of someone who had already seen enough and was about to see considerably more. She turned away from the supply cart and toward the trauma bay, and as she moved through the antiseptic air of the ER, past the nurses who were simply following protocol and the physicians who were simply following orders and the administrative machinery that would have preferred she remain invisible, something in her face changed. The trembling stopped completely. The voice that had been kept so carefully low seemed to settle deeper into her chest where it could draw on reserves the fluorescent-lit hospital had no idea existed. Sergeant Major Calderon will not die on my watch. The thought wasn't something she said aloud. It was something deeper than words, something that moved beneath her skin like muscle memory returning, like someone waking from a very long sleep. And what happened next didn't just change Sacred Heart. It ended the life that Dr. Caldwell thought he was living. The overhead page crackled at 2,315 hours, and the voice that came through was not the usual calm hospital tone. Brooke the Bulldog to Administrator's Office. Brooke the Bulldog, your leash is waiting. Laughter rippled through the ER station like electricity through water. 12 staff members heard it. Every single one. The night shift nurse at Station 4 snorted. The resident at the trauma desk looked away. A phlebotomist actually covered her mouth. Brooke felt the heat rise behind her eyes, but she did not let her hands shake. She set down the chart she was holding, slowly, deliberately, and walked toward Caldwell's office with the same measured pace she used to walk toward Sangin firefights. One foot in front of the other. No hurry. No fear. The tear came anyway, hot and sudden, but she wiped it away with the back of her hand before she knocked on his door, and when she stepped inside, her face was a mask. Caldwell sat behind his mahogany desk like a man who had never been questioned in his life. His tie was still perfect at 11:15 p.m. His coffee cup was monogrammed. You questioned my trauma assessment in front of residents, he said, not looking up from the file he was reading. Sullivan, that Marine's case is catastrophic. Spinal involvement. Massive internal bleeding. You're not a doctor. You're barely a competent nurse. The words were designed to land like scalpel cuts, precise and deep. Brooke stood with her hands at her sides and spoke in a voice like still water, calm and flat and deeper than it had been a moment before. Sergeant Major Calderon deserves every chance we can give him, Doctor. She did not use his first name. She did not apologize. Caldwell's jaw tightened. He was not accustomed to being contradicted by people in scrubs. The next assault came at 0130 hours when he paged her to the supply closet in the far corner of the hospital, the one where the spare ventilators and foot stands gathered dust. She knew before she arrived what this was. Ambush. He was standing 3 inches from her when she entered, close enough that she could smell his coffee breath, close enough that he was using his height, a full 4 inches on her, as a weapon. "Your employment is under review for insubordination," he said quietly, so quietly that only she could hear. "I've documented 6 instances of you exceeding your scope of practice. You think you know better than physicians? You're a night shift nurse who couldn't cut it anywhere else. You probably work here because no hospital in a real city would have you." His eyes were searching hers, hunting for the crack that would tell him his words had broken something. She did not give it to him. One measured breath. Her hand stayed open at her sides. The tear came again, just one, and she wiped it away without looking down, without breaking eye contact, without giving him the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. "I know what a savable patient looks like, sir." She did not say it angrily. She said it like someone stating a fact. What Caldwell did not know was that the voice he was hearing was not Brooke Sullivan, the night nurse. It was the voice of Major Sullivan, the one who had been trained to absorb punishment and remain standing. The one who had gone to ground in Sangin for 72 hours without water, reporting coordinates while bleeding from shrapnel wounds in both legs. The one who had been told that everything she was, her rank, her unit, her name, would be erased, and she had accepted that erasure and moved forward anyway. Caldwell thought he was breaking a hospital employee. He was actually standing 3 inches from a woman who had already lost everything and discovered she could not be broken. At 0630 hours, during shift change in the parking lot, he made his final move. He gathered 12 departing nurses, every single one who worked the afternoon rotation, and announced in a voice loud enough to carry across the asphalt, effective immediately, "Brooke Sullivan is demoted from trauma nursing duties. She will be reassigned to intake processing. Her judgment is compromised and her insubordination has been documented in her personnel file." The words hung in the humid Jacksonville air like humidity itself. Brooke stood in her scrubs, still wearing the same clothes she had worn for a 10-hour shift, and watched her colleagues avert their eyes. Some of them had worked beside her for 3 years. Some of them she had trained. She watched them get into their cars with the careful movements of people who did not want to be noticed. She heard the engine start. She heard the tires crunching on gravel. The parking lot light flickered, that irregular stutter that happens when fixtures are about to fail, and then the lot was quiet. She took one measured breath. She felt the wetness on her cheek. She wiped it away without looking down, without breaking eye contact with Caldwell, and she spoke in a voice that carried across the empty lot like a command. "Sergeant Major Calderon will not die on my watch, and neither will the truth." Caldwell's face went white. Not because of her words. Because of her voice. Because for just 1 second, the night nurse had disappeared, and something else had looked back at him. Something that did not sound like a woman who took orders. Something that sounded like a woman who gave them. But that was not the worst part for Caldwell. The worst part came when he realized she was serious, and by then it was far too late to undo what he had set in motion. He had pushed her out of the system. He had isolated her. He had made his move from social humiliation to strategic sabotage, restricting her access, removing her from critical cases, ensuring she could no longer help the patient he wanted dead. What he had not calculated was that a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for was far more dangerous than a woman trying to keep her job. A woman who had survived erasure from the Pentagon databases did not fear the loss of a nursing license. A woman who had held dying Marines in her arms in the dark understood that some things were worth any price. By 0700 hours, Brooke was officially reassigned to intake processing. The desk sat in a corner of the ER where she could not see the trauma bays. The computer terminal was old, its keyboard sticky, the monitor casting a pale green glow across forms that needed to be filed. Patients arrived and gave their information: chest pain at the age of 47, diabetic foot ulcer, migraine that would not break, and Brooke entered their data with the precision of a surgeon, because precision was what she did, and because she was buying time. Caldwell had made one critical error. He had assumed that removing her from the system would remove her from the fight. He had not understood that some people were trained to operate outside the system entirely. At 1,600 hours, she heard his voice through the open office door. "Yes, I need someone reliable for the Calderon case. Someone who understands treatment futility. Sullivan's too emotionally invested, apparently she knows the family." A pause. Then, "Good. Keep him comfortable. Comfort measures only as of 1,400 hours. I'll review his status at rounds tomorrow." The decision had been made. The Sergeant Major was being allowed to die. What Caldwell did not know was that Major Brooke Sullivan, who had been trained in special operations medicine by the best field surgeons the Marine Corps had ever produced, was now sitting 20 feet away at an intake desk with access to every patient file in Sacred Heart Hospital. And she had nowhere to go and nothing to lose, which meant she had everything to play for. The intake desk was fluorescent gray and smelled like spilled coffee and desperation. Brooke sat there at 0700 hours on Tuesday morning, processing admission paperwork for patients she would never see again, and understood without being told that this was the point. Caldwell had moved her 3 floors down, 2 buildings over, far enough from the trauma bays that she could hear the sirens arrive but not answer them. Her badge still worked, technically. It just didn't open the doors that mattered anymore. By Wednesday night, the restrictions had crystallized into something worse than a formal demotion. Her shift moved to 1,500 to 2,300 hours, overlapping with the day staff for exactly 2 hours at shift change, isolated from the night crew who actually ran the ICU. The staffing schedule was elegant in its cruelty. Caldwell had done this before. She could see it in the precision of the cuts, the way he'd arranged the rotation so she'd have no allies, no continuity, no chance to build relationships with night shift nurses who might cover for her. The master schedule on the break room wall showed her name in different colored text than everyone else. It wasn't accidental. It was a message printed daily in courier font. The badge restriction came Friday afternoon. A memo from security, formal and typed, informing her that her access to intensive care and all trauma units had been suspended pending investigation of her conduct. Not revoked. Suspended. The language left room for appeals she would never file, forms she would never complete. Caldwell had locked her out of the places where Calderon was dying, one monitored breath at a time. She walked past the security office and didn't slow down. Didn't ask questions. The composure had settled into something harder now, something that looked like acceptance but was actually reconnaissance. She was mapping the building in her mind. Every entrance, every service corridor, every camera position. Habits from a life she wasn't supposed to remember. Danny called her Friday night at 2,100 hours. Not a text. A call. His voice was tight with the kind of control that only came from military discipline or complete panic, sometimes both. "Mom, I need you to listen and not ask questions." "I'm listening." "Sergeant Major Calderon is in ICU 4. Room for 16. A friend of mine works badge access. He can generate a one-time credential for you. It expires at 0230 hours. You get one shot." Brooke closed her eyes. "Why would you?" "Because he's dying. Because that doctor is lying about what my commanding officer did. Because Calderon told me last month he trusts you more than he trusts any of his own doctors. And because I counted, Mom. I counted the names on his care team and there's not a single person left in the hospital who owes him anything except you." She didn't ask how Danny knew the restrictions were in place. Didn't ask how his friend could manipulate the badge system. Didn't ask what her son had become in the years since he'd put on that uniform. Instead she said, "Send it to my personal email. I'll use it once. That's all." At 0200 hours, Brooke stood outside ICU 4 with a temporary badge that didn't exist in any system. The hallway was the color of old bone and hummed with the white noise of machines that never slept. The night nurse assigned to the ICU was stationed at the far end of the unit. She knew because she'd watched the staffing board, knew because Caldwell had specifically assigned the night supervisor to cover 6 rooms instead of 4, spreading the staff so thin that Calderon's corner of the unit was functionally abandoned. Protocol. All of it perfectly within protocol. That was what made it so efficient. The door to ICU opened without sound. Calderon lay motionless on the bed, his chest still wrapped but the incisions healing with the discipline of someone whose body had learned to repair itself under fire. The monitors around him beeped with the steady rhythm of a man holding on to something, consciousness, dignity, rage, by willpower alone. His left arm lay across the sheets, the muscles of a career Marine still visible even through the weight loss of trauma and hospital time. His eyes moved when she entered. Recognition. Fear. Then something that looked like gratitude, though Calderon's face wasn't built for soft emotions. Sullivan. His voice came out fractured, barely above the ventilator's hiss. Shouldn't be here. I know. Caldwell will. I know that too. She moved to the monitor without permission, without hesitation, without the deferential posture she'd been performing for 8 days. Her hands moved on their own, the way hands do when they remember the work they were trained for. She checked the vitals first, blood pressure stable at 118/74, which was wrong, which meant Caldwell had ordered something to keep him artificially stable, which meant the next crisis would be sudden and total. The chart told her more. Palliative order documented. No escalation protocol. No code status discussion. Family conference with Caldwell alone, note sealed by his administrative privilege, note she wasn't authorized to read but understood perfectly. She began quietly. A 14-gauge for line, fresh medication lock, running normal saline at a slow infusion rate, the kind of baseline preparation that looked passive but required knowledge. She checked the defibrillator position. Counted the crash cart contents without opening drawers. Her movements were small and practiced, a nurse doing routine care, and if anyone had been watching they would have seen exactly that. What they wouldn't have seen was the tactical assessment happening in parallel, where the emergency equipment was how many seconds to get hands on the crash cart, whether she could position Calderon's bed for CPR access without moving him so much that monitors alarmed. At 0255 hours, she was reviewing the chart when footsteps approached from the hallway. Caldwell appeared in the doorway like something that had finally caught her scent. His expression was pleasant, which was the worst thing his expression could be. Sullivan. You're not authorized to be in this room. His voice was conversational. That was worse than anger. Anger would have been honest. How did you get past security? She didn't answer. Didn't offer the badge. Didn't explain. Just looked at him with the kind of stillness that comes from having watched men die and survived it. I'm calling this in immediately. He pulled out his phone. One call went to hospital administration, the number on speed dial. There was no hesitation in his fingers, which meant he'd made this call before, to other nurses, in other rooms, for other reasons. The second call went to HR. The third went to the State Licensing Bureau. She could hear him on the phone in the hallway, voice pitched just loud enough to carry. Unauthorized patient contact. Violation of access restrictions. Potential HIPAA breach. I'm documenting everything. At 0320 hours, Calderon's monitors changed. PVCs at first, premature ventricular contractions, single beats where there should be none, the electrical system of his heart flickering. Then runs of VTAC, his rhythm sliding into the dangerous places where hearts go before they stop. Brooke was already moving toward the crash cart when Caldwell reappeared in the doorway, his phone in his hand like a weapon. Step away from the patient, Sullivan. You're restricted from care. I'm calling a physician-only code. She didn't step away. Didn't acknowledge the order. Just continued assessing. The monitors showed deterioration that was too fast, too coordinated. Something artificial about it. Something that felt less like a patient failing and more like a patient being allowed to fail. Caldwell paged overhead. His voice came through the hospital intercom smooth and final. Physician-led code, ICU 4. Nursing staff maintain distance. Physician-led resuscitation. Brooke watched as the rhythm flattened. Watched as Calderon's chest went still. Watched as the man who had saved her son's life crossed the line from conscious to absent, and the only sound in the room was the flat-line tone of the monitor and the sound of her own breathing, steady as a combat medic's breathing had to be, because panic killed patients faster than any disease ever could. At 0342 hours, they arrived. 12 doctors. She counted them, each one in white coats bearing the insignia of departments and specialties and institutional authority, and they moved into the room with the coordinated precision of men who had done this before, who had come to pronounce death rather than prevent it. Caldwell stood at the head of the bed, orchestrating like a conductor. The doctors assessed for 45 seconds, she counted those seconds too, and then Caldwell's voice cut through the silence of the room like a scalpel. Futility of care. Time of death, 0343 hours. He looked at the clock on the wall. Made it official. Made it final. Brooke stood motionless as the doctors began filing out, as the machines were silenced, as the room transformed from a space of hope to a space of paperwork. And then she looked at the crash cart. At Calderon's still chest. At the monitor that was no longer even pretending to search for a heartbeat. At the 12 doctors who were already writing their notes, already moving on to the next patient, the next failure, the next acceptable loss. And something in her face must have changed, because Caldwell paused in the doorway. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second, long enough for him to see that the timid nurse was gone, long enough for him to realize he'd made a calculation error, long enough for him to understand that he had been wrong about who he was standing next to. Then she reached for the defibrillator with hands as steady as a sniper's hands, and the sound of the crash cart wheels breaking free from their locked position echoed through the ICU like a challenge that could not be ignored. The monitor flatlined at 03 for 2 hours. One unbroken tone. One horizontal line across the screen. One Marine with no heartbeat. Time of death, 0343, Caldwell announced from the doorway, his voice pitched for the corridor. Not a question. A proclamation. He said it again, louder, I'm calling time of death at 0343 hours. This patient is expired. Brooke didn't move. She stood at the bedside, hands at her sides, watching the green line refuse to spike. Caldwell nodded once, a signal, and the exodus began. 12 doctors. She counted them. Every single one. The cardiologist who had worked this patient 40 minutes ago. The trauma surgeon. The 2 intensivists. The anesthesiologist. The resident physicians. The fellows. The nurses' representatives. All 12 arranged in a deliberate line between Brooke and the crash cart, moving in synchronized choreography toward the door like pallbearers leaving a funeral they'd already decided had concluded. Sullivan. Caldwell's voice had the texture of ice cracking. You're dismissed. Leave now or I'm calling security for forcible removal. The room contracted. 12 bodies between her and the patient. 12 white coats moving toward the hallway. 12 sets of eyes deliberately fixed on anything but her face. Brooke took one measured breath. The air tasted like antiseptic and something else, something like the metallic edge of a decision being made. One tear escaped. She didn't let it fall more than an inch before she wiped it away, the back of her hand efficient, clinical. She didn't break eye contact with Caldwell. No, she said. The doctors stopped. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. The fluorescent panels overhead hummed their mechanical dirge. The ventilators wheezed in the adjacent beds. The heart monitor continued its flat line, that single tone like a siren that nobody was answering. Caldwell's jaw clenched. Security is en route. You have 30 seconds to vacate this room. No, Brooke repeated. He nodded. A small, precise gesture. The 12 doctors resumed their exit, their shoulders slightly higher now, their pace fractionally faster. The cardiology fellow didn't look back. The trauma surgeon kept his eyes on the floor. One by one, they filed past her like water flowing around a stone, their collective silence heavier than any word could have been. Caldwell positioned himself in the doorway, his phone already in his hand. Recording. Documenting an authorized resuscitation attempt by suspended staff member, he said to the device. Potential violation of patient do not resuscitate protocol. This action will be reviewed by state licensing and hospital administration. Brooke's hands moved before her brain caught up. The sterile tray was 3 feet away. Her fingers found the scalpel, not the combat knife from Sangin, but close enough, the same weight, the same balance point. Muscle memory took over. The kind of memory that didn't ask permission. The kind that came from having done this once before in a burning vehicle with mortar rounds turning the sand into air, with a man's chest cavity already open to the world and his heart already stopped. She cracked the sternum access. The skin opened. The ribs separated. Her fingers found the still heart and began manual compression with the rhythm of a machine. Not frantic. Not desperate. Methodical. Trained. The kind of compression that belonged to someone who had kept a man alive for 11 minutes while calling in medevac under fire. The monitor fluttered. Caught. Spiked. A rhythm emerged, faint, irregular, but present. The flat line became a wavering V-shape, became something closer to a heartbeat. The tone changed pitch. Higher. Faster. Alive. Caldwell's face went the color of the bathroom tiles. Then red. Then something worse than red, a kind of grayish-white that meant he was recalculating everything at once and not finding solutions. You've just ended your career, Sullivan. His voice had lost its ice and picked up panic. That's assault. That's practicing medicine without a license. That's criminal negligence. He was already dialing. She could hear him in the hallway, his voice dropping to the controlled tones of someone used to being obeyed. First call, the hospital board. We have a situation. An unauthorized staff member has performed invasive procedures on a patient without authorization. Second call, HR. I need documentation of every moment of contact with Brooke Sullivan in the last hour. I want timestamps. Third call, the State Licensing Bureau. I'm reporting a critical violation. A suspended staff member performed open cardiac surgery without credentials, without authorization, without legal standing. Each call was a nail. Each nail was a door closing. At 0430 hours, security arrived and deactivated her badge while she was still compressing Calderon's heart. The magnetic click of rejection echoed through the ICU. She heard it but didn't stop working. The badge was just plastic and microchips. The heart was still beating under her hands. At 0600 hours, they cleared her locker while she was cleaning blood from her forearms in the trauma bay sink. The water ran pink, then clear, then pink again. She watched her hands move under the water, steady hands, trained hands, hands that had held lives together in places the people who were clearing her locker had never been. At 0800 hours, the termination letter arrived in the ICU itself, hand-delivered by the Chief of Security, printed on hospital letterhead, signed by 3 administrators. Gross insubordination. Unauthorized procedures. Patient endangerment. Effective immediately. An escort would be provided. Brooke was still at Calderon's bedside when they handed it to her. His rhythm was stable now. His oxygen sat was climbing. The fluid was running clear. His pupils had started to respond to light, a sign that there were still neurons firing under all that damaged bone and flesh. Signs of life that Caldwell had already written off as impossible. She looked at the letter. She looked at Caldwell through the glass partition of the ICU room. He was on his phone again, his face the color of old concrete, making arrangements for the next move, the next call, the next phase of the dismantling. She had seen this before. 3 other nurses over the months. First one, Rebecca Chen, who had caught him falsifying a chart. She'd lasted 2 weeks after the first performance review. The second, Marcus Webb, who had questioned why a patient's pain medication was being withheld. His security badge stopped working on a Tuesday. The third, Elena Vasquez, who had looked at him during a meeting and said the word whistleblower out loud. She had been terminated for insubordination within 48 hours. This was his pattern. Identify the threat. Document the offense. Isolate the person. Then call the board, call the lawyers, call whoever needed to hear that they were dangerous. But he'd never dealt with someone who had already been erased once before. Brooke walked to her Honda Civic in the parking garage at 0830. The morning light was amber through the concrete supports. Her shift was over. Her career was over. Her life as Brooke Sullivan, night shift nurse at Sacred Heart, was officially concluded. She got in the driver's seat and tried to turn the key. Her hands wouldn't move. She tried again. The fingers wouldn't close. The arm wouldn't turn the ignition. The neural pathways that had fired under mortar fire, that had crushed a sternum open with bare hands, that had called in coordinates while bleeding, those same pathways had simply stopped responding. She laid her head on the steering wheel. The engine was dead. She was dead. Everything was dead, and she was sitting in a car in a parking garage in Jacksonville, Florida, in a city she didn't belong in, with a rank she couldn't claim, with a son who didn't know what she was, with a secret that was eating her alive from the inside out. The steering wheel was cold against her forehead. She didn't cry. That would have required moving. Instead, she sat there, parked in Space 47, and waited for someone to find her. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she could already hear the helicopter in the distance, that distinctive whump-whump-whump of rotor blades cutting air in a pattern she recognized from the Pentagon briefings, from the call signs on radios, from a life she had spent 18 months trying to bury. Someone was coming. At 1,100 hours, the background check flagged something. A routine database search, the kind that takes 3 minutes, the kind Caldwell himself had expedited just to find grounds for Brooke's final termination, bounced against a classified firewall in the Department of Defense system. The kind of firewall that doesn't just say no. The kind that sends automated alerts to 3 federal agencies simultaneously. The Pentagon had a record. Major Brooke Sullivan, USMC Special Operations Command, Service Number Redacted, Security Clearance Level TS-SCI, Active Investigation Status, Witnessed, Classified Tribunal. The system didn't know that Major Sullivan was supposed to be dead. That she had been ceremonially erased from every public database 18 months ago and given a new social security number and told by the Pentagon that Brooke Sullivan had never existed and must never surface again. The system only knew that someone had just tried to fire her, and that triggered the protocols. By 11:10 hours, the alerts had reached the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, the FBI's Counterintelligence Division, and something with no acronym that answered directly to the Pentagon's Office of Special Counsel. They were all calling Sacred Heart simultaneously. The administrator's office had become a holding room. Brooke sat in an ergonomic chair, the kind executives picked out, the kind that cost more than her monthly rent, and waited. Her hands rested flat on her thighs. No trembling. No fidgeting. The training ran deeper than the fear. Muscle memory wasn't just how your hands moved in a trauma bay. It was how your breathing stayed level when the world was about to change again. Danny arrived first. He came through the glass doors in dress blues, still in utilities from base, his cover tucked under one arm. The administrator had called him. Captain Martinez had made the decision the moment the first federal inquiry came through. A son needed to know. A son needed to be present. He saw his mother sitting in that expensive chair, and his jaw went tight. When he spoke, his voice cracked on the word. Not because he didn't know what it meant, he did, he'd pieced it together in pieces over 18 months, the way she moved, the way her eyes tracked exits, the way she didn't flinch at loud noises. But he'd never said it to her face. Major. Brooke's eyes closed for exactly 1 second. Then she looked at her son and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would make it right. The naval intelligence officer arrived at 1,125 hours with hands that trembled so badly the classified folder shook. She was young, maybe 30, maybe younger, and she'd clearly never had to read a document like this to someone's living, breathing family. Her voice was steady anyway. Military training beat emotion every time. She read from the trembling pages. 2 silver stars for Valor under fire. Bronze star with Valor, awarded for. She paused. The pages rattled. Actions that resulted in the rescue of 14 personnel under active combat conditions. 2 purple hearts. The second from an explosion in. Another pause. The words on the page were redacted, but her voice carried the weight of whatever lay underneath. The injuries were significant. Recovery took 16 months. Danny's hands had clenched into fists. He wasn't looking at his mother. He couldn't. Looking at her would make it real in a way his mind wasn't ready to process. The SEAL team leader came next. He was older than Brooke by maybe 5 years, and he moved with the kind of precision that comes from spending 30 years in rooms where the wrong movement could kill everyone. He stood at attention, literal military attention, boots together, shoulders back, the kind of stance that civilians don't recognize but soldiers feel in their spines like a salute made flesh. He recited her decorations. Not read them. Recited them. The way you recite something you've carried in your chest for years, something that matters enough to memorize, to speak aloud in the presence of witnesses. His voice was steady and strong and carried through the open office door to the corridor beyond, where the administrator stood frozen, where nurses passing in the hallway stopped moving. Major Brooke Sullivan. Silver Star, Operation Enduring Freedom, Sangin Valley, 2018. Silver Star, Operation Inherent Resolve, Syria, 2019. Bronze Star with Valor, Operation Spartan Shield and Inherent Resolve combined. 2 purple hearts. Honorable Service, Marine Special Operations Command, Direct Action Raid Element, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. The SEAL team leader dropped his hand and stepped back and didn't look away from Brooke's eyes. And in the corridor beyond the glass walls, Dr. Caldwell stood frozen. His face had gone the color of old concrete. The FBI agent was 60, maybe older, with gray at his temples and the kind of tired that comes from knowing how many people get away with things. He held a file that was mostly redacted, just black lines and cleared space and a few words left visible. One word appeared twice: tribunal. Major Sullivan was the primary witness in a sealed war crimes tribunal, he said. His voice was calm, clinical, the voice of someone who had testified 1,000 times. The case involves actions by a private military contractor. The tribunal was sealed for national security purposes. However, the investigation into your employment termination triggered a federal review of your access to classified information, Dr. Caldwell. The agent hadn't looked up when he said Caldwell's name. He didn't need to. The words would reach him. Sergeant Major Calderon is scheduled to provide testimony in the same tribunal. His testimony corroborates Major Sullivan's account. The contractor in question has an interest in preventing that testimony from occurring. The agent turned a page. Another redacted section. Then a name, the only name left visible on that entire page, Caldwell's brother-in-law. Defense contractor. Subcontracted to Blackwater Successor Company. The murder would have looked like standard medical futility. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the hospital board president stood up. His face was ashen. He was looking at the FBI agent, but his words went to the room. Begin a full audit of Dr. Caldwell's patient files. Immediately. And lock down his access to any electronic medical records. By 1600 hours, the state medical board had arrived. By 1800 hours, Caldwell's license was suspended pending criminal investigation. By 2000 hours, he was being escorted from Sacred Heart by security, his hands shaking, his face the color of bone. Over the next 4 hours in the conference room, the investigation Caldwell had launched against Brooke became the mechanism of his own destruction. The expedited background check had brought federal attention. The employment review had triggered an audit of his own records. The HIPAA complaint he'd filed had required examination of his access logs, which is where they found it, his search pattern. He'd been tracking her credentials. watching her clearance status, waiting for her to slip up so he could have cause. The board discovered he'd falsified 6 patient records to justify futility determinations. 6 patients. All 6 were witnesses or whistleblowers in various cases. They found kickbacks from a medical supply company, the one owned by his brother-in-law, the defense contractor who stood to lose $400 million if the tribunal testimony went forward. 18 months of payments. $50,000 a month. Caldwell had been on a retainer. Protecting assets. Making problems disappear. The other nurses. 3 other nurses he'd systematically targeted, reassigned, forced out. Each one had questioned his treatment decisions on patients connected to the fraud case. Each one had seen something. Each one had been erased quietly before they could become a problem like Brooke had become. 18 months later, Brooke walked through Sacred Heart's main entrance at 0600 hours on a Tuesday morning. The rain had stopped, but the asphalt still gleamed like black glass, reflecting the pale sun. Her clothes were civilian, grey slacks, a navy blouse, but the volunteer lanyard around her neck identified her as a patient advocate. That's what they'd called her position, patient advocate. It was a real job. It was also permission. She stopped at the night security desk. The man behind it wore a navy blue uniform that didn't quite fit anymore. His name tag read Caldwell. He was part of his plea agreement, community service at Sacred Heart, the place he'd nearly destroyed, under the watch of the people he'd tried to bury. 5 years probation. License permanently revoked. His hand shook constantly now, a tremor that had started after the interrogation and never fully stopped. He raised his eyes just long enough to see the oak leaves pinned to her lanyard, the major's insignia the hospital administrator had quietly allowed, a private gesture that honored what she'd done. Then he looked away, his jaw tight, a muscle jumping below his ear. She walked past without speaking. The elevator to ICU recovery hummed softly as it climbed. Fluorescent lights reflected in the polished doors. Somewhere on the 3rd floor, a monitor beeped its steady rhythm. Normal hospital sounds. The sounds of people living who should have died. Calderon was sitting up. He was thinner than he'd been. The months of recovery had taken weight he'd earned over decades, but his eyes were clear. Sergeant Major, Marine, the kind of person who understood the weight of command and the price of loyalty and exactly what it meant when someone had held a beating heart in their hands and refused to let it stop. Danny was there in dress blues, standing at attention beside the bed. He'd made sergeant while his commander was recovering. The kind of career continuation that meant the tribunal would move forward, that the contractors would face consequences, that the machine had finally turned in the right direction. Calderon saw Brooke, and his eyes tracked to her jacket, to the place where she kept the faded unit patch. The one he'd cut from his own sleeve in Sangin in 2018, pressed into her palm with both hands shaking from blood loss and adrenaline and the knowledge that Major Sullivan had just pulled him back from the edge of forever. She reached up and touched her jacket over her heart where the patch was still sewn inside the lining, still kept close, still carried like a prayer. Calderon reached out. His hand was steady. He touched the fabric through the jacket, feeling the shape of it, confirming it was still there, still honored, still kept safe. His voice came out rough, Semper Fi, Major. Brooke sat beside the Marine she'd saved twice, her son standing at attention between them, and for the first time in 3 years, her hands didn't tremble. Outside, Sacred Heart woke to another shift change. Nurses moved through fluorescent hallways, invisible and essential, their stories unknown. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrubs, saving lives in the dark. If you've ever been underestimated by someone with power, please like and subscribe. And in the comments, tell us, have you ever judged someone only to find out you were dead wrong? Because Brooke Sullivan's story didn't end in that parking garage. It ended with a Marine saluting a Major, and the whole hospital finally knowing what kind of woman they'd tried to break.